Hello there, weary traveler, and welcome back to this quiet corner of history. Before we begin our journey into the dust and blood of the Crusades, into a world of sacred oaths and secret treasures, I wanted to extend a warm greeting to you. Whether you're nestled under the covers, ready to drift off to sleep, or simply looking to unwind with some quiet historical storytelling, I'm so glad you've chosen to join me tonight. Let the cares of the modern world begin to fade, and allow your mind to drift back in time with the sound of my voice. Tonight, our story takes us back 900 years to a time of profound and violent faith. It is a story of an order of men who were both monks and soldiers, who took vows of poverty yet controlled wealth that rivaled kingdoms, and who rose from the humblest of beginnings to become the most powerful and feared organization in Christendom, only to be utterly destroyed in the most dramatic and brutal fashion. They are figures of history but also of legend, their names forever associated with the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, and 1,000 conspiracy theories. Tonight, we explore the rise and fall of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, known to the world as the Knights Templar. Our story begins not in the grand cathedrals of Europe, but on the dangerous, sun-beaten roads of the Holy Land. In the year 1099, the First Crusade had achieved its goal. After a long and bloody campaign, the Christian armies of Europe had captured the holy city of Jerusalem from Muslim control. For the knights and nobles who had taken the cross, it was the fulfillment of a divine mission. The sacred sites where Christ had walked, preached, and died were once again in Christian hands. The news spread across Europe like wildfire, and soon, a new kind of traveler began to make the long and perilous journey east, the pilgrim. These were not soldiers, but ordinary men and women of faith, rich and poor, who felt a powerful calling to see the holy places for themselves. They traveled for thousands of miles, by sea and by land, driven by a desire to pray at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or to be baptized in the River Jordan. But the journey was fraught with danger. Though the major cities were held by the newly established Crusader states, the roads connecting them were not secure. Bands of robbers, remnants of the defeated Muslim armies, and opportunistic bandits preyed on the vulnerable pilgrims. They would hide in the rocky mountain passes and ambush traveling parties, robbing them, taking them captive for ransom, or simply killing them. For a pilgrim to travel from the port city of Jaffa to the holy city of Jerusalem was to take their life into their own hands. The newly crowned king of Jerusalem, Baldwin I, had too few men and too few resources to properly police these vital routes. The Crusader kingdom was an island in a hostile sea. Its knights constantly needed to defend its fragile borders. The pilgrims, who brought much-needed money and spiritual legitimacy to the new kingdom, were being slaughtered. The problem was dire, and the solution would come from a very unexpected quarter. Around the year 1119, nearly 2 decades after the capture of Jerusalem, a French knight from the region of Champagne arrived at the court of King Baldwin II. His name was Hugues de Payens. He was not a great lord or a famous warrior, but a modest, pious nobleman, a veteran of the First Crusade who had remained in the Holy Land. He was accompanied by 8 of his relatives and friends, a small band of knights who had been deeply moved by the plight of the pilgrims. They came before the king with a radical proposal. They wished to form a new kind of religious order, a brotherhood of knights who would dedicate their lives to God, but who would do so not by praying in a monastery, but by fighting on the roads. They would take the traditional monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they would also take a 4th vow, to protect the pilgrims of the Holy Land with their swords. They would be warrior monks, a fusion of two worlds that had, until then, been seen as complete opposites. A monk's life was one of peace, prayer, and contemplation. A knight's life was one of violence, wealth, and worldly glory. The idea of combining the two was revolutionary, perhaps even heretical. But King Baldwin II was a practical man, and he had a serious problem on his hands. This small group of knights was offering a solution. He agreed to their proposal. The king granted the new order a place to live, a wing of his own royal palace on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This was a place of immense historical and religious significance. The palace stood on the very ground where the great Temple of Solomon was believed to have once stood, the most sacred site in Judaism. The nearby Al-Aqsa Mosque was referred to by the Crusaders as the Templum Solomonis, the Temple of Solomon. It was from this location that the new order would take its name. They called themselves the Paupers Camillitones Christi Templique Salomonicide, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The Knights Templar was born. For the first 9 years of their existence, the Templars remained a small and obscure group. The original 9 knights, led by Hugues de Payens, were joined by no others. They had no official uniform, no formal rule of conduct, and very little in the way of resources. They were so poor, according to their own legends, that 2 knights had to share a single horse, a detail that would later be immortalized on their famous seal, which depicts 2 knights riding one steed. They patrolled the roads, fighting off bandits and escorting pilgrims, living a life of austerity and prayer. But their future was uncertain. The idea of a military monastic order was still viewed with suspicion by many in the church. For the order to survive and grow, it needed the one thing that mattered above all else: the official sanction of the Pope. In 1129, Hugues de Payens traveled back to Europe with a small delegation to seek that sanction. He journeyed to the city of Troyes, in his home region of Champagne, where a great church council was being held. This was the moment that would make or break the Knights Templar, and it was here that they found their most powerful and influential champion, a man who was arguably the most respected religious figure in all of Europe, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was a Cistercian abbot, a theologian, a writer, and a charismatic preacher. His piety and intellect were legendary. When he spoke, popes and kings listened. He was a nephew of one of the original 9 knights, and he was captivated by the idea of the Templars. He saw in them the potential for a new kind of Christian warrior, a man who could wield a sword not for personal gain or glory, but for the glory of God. He saw them as the personification of a holy war, an army of Christ. At the Council of Troyes, Bernard of Clairvaux threw his immense prestige behind Hugues de Payens and his small order. He argued passionately in their favor, convincing the assembled bishops and cardinals of the righteousness of their cause. The council not only gave the Templars its official blessing, but it also commissioned Bernard to write a formal rule for the order, a detailed code of conduct that would govern every aspect of a Templar's life. This document, known as the Latin Rule, was the foundation upon which the entire Templar organization would be built. The Rule of the Knights Templar was a strict and demanding code. It consisted of 72 clauses that laid out the duties and obligations of a brother of the order. A Templar Knight was to live a life of extreme simplicity and discipline. He was to own no personal property. All his possessions, including his horse and his armor, belonged to the order. He was to be chaste, foregoing the company of women. He was to be obedient, following the commands of his superiors without question. His daily life was a rigorous schedule of prayer and military training. He was to eat his meals in silence, listening to a reading from the scriptures. His clothes were to be simple, without any fine fabrics or decorations. He was forbidden from hunting, from playing games of chance, and from engaging in frivolous conversation. The rule even dictated the length of his hair and beard. He was to be shorn, but not tonsured like a traditional monk, and his beard was to be worn long, a sign of his warrior status. The most famous symbol of the Templars, their white mantle emblazoned with a red cross, was also established at this time. The white represented the purity of their monastic vows, while the red cross, added a few years later by the Pope, symbolized their willingness to shed their blood for Christ, their martyrdom. It was a powerful and instantly recognizable uniform, a symbol of their unique dual identity. Bernard of Clairvaux did more than just write their rule. He became their greatest publicist. He wrote a famous treatise called De Laudi Novi Militiae, or In Praise of the New Knighthood, in which he contrasted the virtuous, selfless Templar knight with the vain, worldly knights of secular society. He wrote, "The knight of Christ may strike with confidence and die with greater confidence, for he serves Christ when he strikes and serves himself when he dies. He is a minister of God for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of the good." This was a powerful endorsement. It gave the Templars a theological justification for their existence. It made the act of killing in a holy war not a sin, but an act of Christian charity. With the blessing of the Pope and the powerful endorsement of Saint Bernard, the fortunes of the Knights Templar were transformed overnight. What had been a small, obscure band of 9 knights in Jerusalem exploded into a massive, international organization. Hugues de Payens, during his tour of Europe, was met with a wave of enthusiasm. Young noblemen, fired by the ideals of the Crusade and the promise of a life of purpose, flocked to join the order. Kings and great lords, eager to show their piety and to contribute to the defense of the Holy Land, donated vast sums of money and huge tracts of land to the Templars. In just a few years, the Templars went from being the poor fellow soldiers to one of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in Europe. They established a network of commanderies or preceptories all across the continent, from England and France to Spain and Italy. These were large agricultural estates, farms, and manors, which were managed by Templar brothers and worked by local labor. These preceptories served as recruiting centers, training grounds, and, most importantly, a massive source of revenue. The profits from these European estates, from the sale of wool, grain, and wine, were all funneled east to fund the Templars' primary mission, the Holy War in Palestine. The speed of their rise was breathtaking. In less than a generation, they had become a formidable military and economic power, a multinational corporation dedicated to the cause of the Crusade. They were a standing army, permanently stationed in the Holy Land, highly trained, superbly equipped, and fanatically disciplined. They answered to no king or secular lord. Their only master was the Pope himself. This gave them an unprecedented degree of autonomy and independence. They were a state within a state, a sacred army with its own rules, its own hierarchy, and its own vast resources. The humble band of 9 knights had become a spiritual and military empire. They were the elite fighting force of the Crusader states, the guardians of the Holy Land, and the bankers of Christendom. Their white mantles were a symbol of courage and piety, feared on the battlefield by their enemies and revered by the faithful across Europe. But their incredible success, their wealth, their power, and their secrecy also planted the seeds of their own destruction. They had risen higher and faster than anyone could have imagined. And the higher they rose, the further they had to fall. The stage was set for a century of glory, followed by a betrayal so sudden and so complete that it would echo through the ages. The golden era of the Knights Templar had begun, but the shadow of their doom was already gathering on a distant horizon. With their foundations firmly established and their coffers overflowing with the donations of a grateful Christendom, the Knights Templar transitioned from a fledgling band of pilgrim protectors into the most formidable military force in the Holy Land. For nearly 2 centuries, they were the backbone of the Crusader states, the elite, professional soldiers in a world of feudal levies and temporary crusading armies. Their white mantles, emblazoned with the stark red cross, became a symbol of unwavering resolve on the battlefield, a sight that inspired hope in their allies and a cold dread in their enemies. The military strength of the Templars was not rooted in numbers alone. At their peak, the order probably never had more than a few thousand full brother knights. Their true power lay in their discipline, their training, their superior equipment, and their unshakable morale. Unlike the secular knights who came to the Holy Land for a season of fighting before returning to their estates in Europe, the Templars were a permanent, standing army. They lived and trained together year-round, honing their skills in a way that no feudal lord could match. Their lives were a constant preparation for war, a seamless blend of monastic devotion and martial practice. A Templar knight was a fearsome opponent. He was a nobleman by birth, trained from boyhood in the arts of war. But unlike a secular knight, he was unburdened by worldly concerns. He had no wife or family to worry about, no lands to manage, and no personal wealth to protect. His entire existence was dedicated to the order and to God. This gave him a singular, fanatical focus in battle. The Templar rule forbade them from retreating unless the odds were more than 3 to 1, and even then, only with the permission of their commander. They were taught to conquer or die, and that death in battle against the infidel was not a tragedy, but a glorious martyrdom that guaranteed immediate entry into heaven. This belief made them almost suicidally brave, willing to charge into situations that other soldiers would deem hopeless. Their battle tactics were built around the devastating power of the heavy cavalry charge that a squadron of Templar knights, mounted on powerful war horses called destriers, would form a tight, wedge-like formation. At the command of their marshal, they would lower their lances and charge as one, a disciplined, unstoppable wave of steel and faith. The impact of such a charge could shatter enemy lines, breaking the morale of even the most seasoned Saracen troops. The Templars were the shock troops of the Crusader armies, the tip of the spear, often held in reserve by the king or commander until the most critical moment of a battle, at which point they would be unleashed to turn the tide. One of the most legendary examples of their military prowess came at the Battle of Montgessard in 1177. The great Muslim leader, Saladin, had invaded the Kingdom of Jerusalem with a massive army of over 20,000 men. The Crusader army, led by the 16-year-old King Baldwin IV, who was tragically afflicted with leprosy, was tiny by comparison, numbering only a few thousand. The situation seemed desperate, but among Baldwin's forces were 80 Knights Templar. At the decisive moment of the battle, these 80 knights, along with a few hundred other secular horsemen, launched a ferocious, seemingly impossible charge directly into the heart of Saladin's much larger army. Their attack was so sudden, so violent, and so unexpected that it threw the Saracen forces into a state of panic and confusion. Saladin's army broke and fled. It was a stunning, miraculous victory against overwhelming odds, and it was the Templars who had led the charge. The legend of Montgessard cemented their reputation as the greatest warriors in Christendom. The internal structure of the order was a strict military hierarchy. At the top was the Grand Master, who was elected for life and served as the supreme commander. Below him were the various officers who managed the order's affairs. The Seneschal, who was the Grand Master's deputy. The Marshal, who was in charge of all military matters. And the Treasurer, who oversaw the order's vast finances. The order was divided into different classes of brothers. At the top were the knights, who had to be of noble birth and were the elite heavy cavalry. Below them were the sergeants, who were drawn from the commoner class. They were skilled soldiers who fought as light cavalry or infantry, and they also served as the administrators and craftsmen who ran the order's estates. Finally, there were the chaplains, the ordained priests who saw to the spiritual needs of the brothers, hearing their confessions and performing Massachusetts. This rigid structure ensured that the order ran with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, both on and off the battlefield. But the Templars' influence extended far beyond the battlefield. As their wealth and landholdings grew, they stumbled into a role that would ultimately become as important as their military mission, and arguably even more revolutionary. They became the first international bankers. The system evolved out of a simple, practical need. A nobleman in England who wished to go on a crusade or pilgrimage to the Holy Land faced a serious logistical problem. He could not carry vast sums of gold and silver with him for the entire journey. It was far too dangerous and cumbersome. The Templars, with their network of commanderies stretching from London to Jerusalem, offered a brilliant solution. The nobleman could deposit his money at the Templar preceptory in London. In return, he would be given a letter of credit, a coded document that detailed the amount of his deposit. He could then travel to the Holy Land with only this letter. Upon his arrival in Jerusalem, he could present the letter at the Templar headquarters, and they would give him his money, minus a small fee for the service. It was, in effect, the world's first system of traveler's checks. It was a revolutionary innovation that made international travel and trade far safer and more efficient. The Templars' reputation for integrity and their formidable military strength meant that their letters of credit were trusted implicitly. No one would dare to rob a Templar courier or to forge a Templar document. Their system was so successful that they soon expanded their financial services. They began to act as treasurers for the kings and nobles of Europe and even for the Pope himself. The Templar Temple in Paris, their headquarters in France, became the center of European finance, a vast treasury where the wealth of nations was stored and managed. They loaned money to kings to finance wars and to nobles to build castles. They managed estates for absentee lords. They collected taxes. They became, in short, the most powerful and trusted financial institution in the world. This immense wealth was, in theory, all dedicated to the cause of the crusade. But it also gave the order a level of political power and influence that was unprecedented. They were not just soldiers and bankers. They were kingmakers, diplomats, and power brokers who operated at the highest levels of European society. Their Grand Master was treated as a head of state, with the same status as a king or an emperor. They were powerful, they were secretive, and they were accountable to no one but the Pope. This independence, which had been their greatest strength, would eventually make them vulnerable. Kings who owed them vast sums of money began to resent their power and their immunity from royal control. The secrecy of their internal operations, born of necessity, began to breed suspicion and jealousy. To understand the source of this incredible wealth and power, we must look away from the battlefields of the Holy Land and back to the quiet, rolling farmlands of Europe. The true engine of the Templar enterprise was their vast network of preceptories. These were the thousands of estates, farms, manors, and even churches that had been donated to the order over the years. Each preceptory was a self-sufficient agricultural and administrative center, run by a handful of Templar brothers. A typical preceptory might consist of a small fortified manor house, a chapel, a dormitory for the brothers, and various farm buildings, all surrounded by hundreds or even thousands of acres of farmland, pastures, and woodlands. Life in a European preceptory was very different from the life of a knight in the Holy Land. It was a quiet, disciplined, and industrious existence. The brothers would rise before dawn for prayers in the chapel, followed by a simple breakfast. Their day would then be spent managing the estate. They would oversee the local peasants who worked the land, ensuring that the fields were plowed, the crops were harvested, and the livestock were tended to. They would keep meticulous accounts of all income and expenditure. They managed mills, wineries, and quarries. They were not just monks. They were highly efficient and skilled estate managers. The preceptory was a business, and its product was revenue for the Holy Land. These establishments were also crucial for the order's other functions. They served as recruiting depots, where young men who wished to join the order would be vetted and begin their training. They were retirement homes for older knights who were no longer fit for battle in the East. And they were safe houses and treasuries, the local branches of the Templar Bank, where a local lord could deposit his valuables for safekeeping. The Templar preceptory was a vital and ubiquitous presence in the medieval landscape. They were a visible symbol of the order's power, wealth, and piety. The life of an individual Templar was one of profound contrasts. He was a man of God, sworn to a life of prayer and contemplation, yet he was also a man of violence, a professional soldier trained to kill. He took a vow of personal poverty, owning nothing himself, yet he was part of an organization that controlled unimaginable wealth. He was a member of a secretive, elite brotherhood, set apart from the secular world, yet his order was deeply enmeshed in the politics and economics of that world. Let us imagine a day in the life of a young knight, newly arrived in the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. His name is Jean, and he is the younger son of a minor French nobleman. He has given up his inheritance, his family, and any hope of marriage to join the order. His day begins before sunrise, with the sound of a bell calling him to the chapel for the first of several daily prayers. He stands in the cool, dark church alongside his brothers, their voices joined in the rhythmic chanting of the psalms. After the service, he proceeds to the refectory for a simple meal, perhaps some bread and a thin vegetable soup, eaten in complete silence as a brother reads from the life of a saint. The rest of his morning is dedicated to the tools of his trade. He spends hours in the training yard, practicing his swordsmanship, his lance work, and his horsemanship. He spars with his fellow knights, their bodies clad in heavy chain mail, the clang of steel on steel echoing under the hot Palestinian sun. He must be a master of his craft, for his life and the lives of his brothers will depend on his skill. In the afternoon, he may be assigned to patrol duty, riding out from the castle with a small squadron of knights and sergeants to guard a section of the road to the River Jordan. They ride in disciplined formation, their eyes scanning the rocky hills for any sign of ambush. They are a reassuring sight to the small band of footsore pilgrims they encounter, whom they greet with a solemn nod before continuing on their way. In the evening, back within the castle walls, there are more prayers, another simple meal, and perhaps a meeting of the chapter where the business of the order is discussed and where brothers who have broken the rule are publicly disciplined. His day ends as it began, with prayer. As he lies down on his simple straw mattress in the communal dormitory, he is exhausted, but his heart is filled with a sense of purpose. He is a soldier of Christ, a guardian of the holy places, and a part of a sacred brotherhood. His life is hard, disciplined, and dangerous, but it has meaning. He is a Templar. This dual existence, the constant tension between the life of a monk and the life of a warrior, was what made the Templars so unique and so effective. But it was also a source of criticism. Some in the church were never entirely comfortable with the idea of a killing monk. They saw the Templars' wealth and their involvement in worldly affairs as a betrayal of their monastic ideals. As the centuries passed, and as the situation in the Holy Land grew more desperate, this criticism would grow louder. The Templars, along with the other military orders like the Hospitallers, were often blamed for the failures of the Crusader states. They were accused of pride, of arrogance, of fighting amongst themselves, and of caring more for their own wealth and power than for the defense of Christendom. There was, perhaps, some truth to these accusations. The Templars had become a powerful and often arrogant institution. They were fiercely protective of their privileges and their independence, but they were also the most dedicated and effective defenders of the Crusader kingdoms. Time and time again, it was the Templars who stood firm when others fled, who charged when others hesitated, and who paid the ultimate price for their devotion. In many of the great and disastrous battles of the later Crusades, it was the Templar Knights who were slain almost to a man, refusing to surrender, fighting to the last. For nearly 200 years, the Knights Templar were the embodiment of the crusading ideal. They were the bridge between the cloister and the battlefield, between the world of finance and the world of faith. They built a remarkable and revolutionary organization that left a lasting mark on European civilization. But their world was changing. The crusading fervor that had given birth to their order was beginning to fade. The political landscape of Europe was shifting, and in the Holy Land, the tide of history was turning against them. The golden age of the Templars, an age of glory, power, and immense wealth, was drawing to a close. A new and terrible chapter was about to begin, a chapter of loss, of exile, and ultimately, of a betrayal so profound that its dark legend continues to fascinate and horrify us to this day. The long, slow decline of the Crusader states would set the stage for the final, tragic act in the history of the Knights Templar. Of course, here is the third 5,000-word part of the script, which covers the decline of the Crusader states and the beginning of the end for the Knights Templar. The Golden Age of the Knights Templar, an era defined by their military glory and immense financial power, was inextricably linked to the fate of the Crusader states they were sworn to protect. As long as the war for the Holy Land continued, the Templars had a clear and undeniable purpose. Their vast wealth, their network of preceptories across Europe, their papal privileges, all of it was justified by their sacred mission as the frontline defenders of Christendom. But in the latter half of the 13th century, the ground beneath their feet began to shift. The political and military situation in the East was deteriorating rapidly, and the very foundation of the Templars' existence was about to crumble. The Crusader states had always been in a precarious position, a thin strip of Christian-held territory surrounded by powerful Muslim neighbors. Their survival had depended on a steady stream of reinforcements and resources from Europe and on the disunity of their enemies. But by the mid-1200s, Both of these factors had changed. The initial religious fervor of the early Crusades had waned in Europe. Kings and nobles were increasingly preoccupied with their own conflicts and political ambitions at home. The great crusading armies of the past were no longer materializing. At the same time, the Muslim world had found a new and formidable leader in the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The Mamluks were a warrior class of slave soldiers who had seized power in Cairo, and they were fiercely dedicated to the cause of jihad, a holy war to drive the Christian Franks out of the Holy Land for good. Under a series of brilliant and ruthless sultans, most notably the fearsome Baibars, the Mamluks began a systematic and relentless campaign to dismantle the Crusader kingdoms. One by one, the great castles and cities that had been the pride of the Crusader states began to fall. The internal squabbles and petty rivalries among the Christian factions in the Holy Land only made them easier targets. The Templars and their great rivals, the Knights Hospitaller, often found themselves at odds, competing for influence and resources, sometimes to the detriment of their shared cause. Despite their bravery, the military orders were simply outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The Templars fought with their customary desperate courage, defending their castles to the last man. But it was a losing battle. The final, tragic act of this long war came in the spring of 1291 at the great port city of Acre. Acre was the last major Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, the capital of the dwindling Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was a bustling, wealthy city, but it was also a tinderbox of competing interests, its defense hampered by the rivalries of the various knightly orders and Italian merchant communes who resided there. The Mamluk Sultan, Al-Ashraf Khalil, arrived before the walls of Acre with a colossal army, one of the largest ever assembled in the medieval period, equipped with a fearsome array of siege engines. The city's defenders were determined to resist, and at the heart of the defense were the Knights Templar, led by their valiant Grand Master, Guillaume de Beaujeu. For weeks, the city endured a relentless bombardment. Mamluk engineers worked to undermine the city's massive walls, while the Christian defenders launched desperate counterattacks. The Templars and Hospitallers fought side by side, their old rivalries forgotten in this final, desperate struggle for survival. The end came on the 18th of May. The Mamluks breached the outer walls and poured into the city. A brutal, street-by-street battle ensued. Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu was mortally wounded while defending the Cursed Tower, one of the key points in the city's defenses. As he was carried from the battle, his knights, seeing their leader fall, began to lose heart. "I am not running away," he is said to have told them. "I am dead." He died shortly after. With the city now lost, the remaining Templar knights retreated to their own massive, fortified compound, which stood on the edge of the sea. It was a fortress within a city, and here they made their last stand. For 10 more days, this small band of knights held out against the entire Mamluk army. They refused all offers of surrender. Finally, on the 28th of May, the Mamluk engineers succeeded in undermining the walls of the Templar fortress. As the Mamluk soldiers swarmed into the breach, the weakened structure collapsed, bringing the tower down upon attackers and defenders alike, burying the last Knights Templar of Acre in the ruins of their own fortress. The fall of Acre was a cataclysmic event. It marked the end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The dream that had inspired 2 centuries of holy war was over. For the Knights Templar, it was more than just a military defeat. It was an existential crisis. Their entire reason for being, the sacred mission that had justified their wealth and their power for nearly 200 years, had vanished. The pilgrims no longer needed their protection because there was nowhere left for them to go. The soldiers of Christ were now an army without a war to fight. The surviving Templars evacuated to the island of Cyprus, which became their new headquarters. But they were a shadow of their former selves. Their morale was shattered, and their purpose was unclear. They began to focus on their financial operations, managing their vast estates in Europe and continuing to serve as the bankers of Christendom. But without the constant, draining expense of the war in the East, their wealth began to accumulate at an even more incredible rate. They were richer and more powerful than ever, but they were also more vulnerable. Their critics now began to ask a dangerous question. What was the point of the Knights Templar? Why should this immensely wealthy, secretive, and independent military order be allowed to exist when the Holy Land was lost? They had become an anomaly, a relic of a bygone era, and their immense wealth, once seen as a necessary tool for a holy cause, was now viewed with deep suspicion and envy. This envy was most acute in the heart of the most powerful kingdom in Europe, France. The French king, Philip IV, known as Philippe le Bel or Philip the Fair, was a complex and enigmatic figure. On the surface, he was a model of Christian piety, a man of simple tastes and austere habits. But beneath this pious exterior was a will of iron and a ruthless, calculating ambition. Philip was obsessed with the idea of a strong, centralized French monarchy, with the king holding absolute power. He saw any institution that operated outside of his direct control as a threat to his authority. And there was no institution more powerful, more independent, and more infuriatingly autonomous within his kingdom than the Knights Templar. Philip's ambition was matched only by his financial desperation. His constant wars with England and with the wealthy cities of Flanders had left the French crown bankrupt. He was constantly searching for new sources of revenue, and he had shown a ruthless willingness to attack wealthy and vulnerable groups to get it. He had arrested all the Jews in France, confiscated their property, and expelled them from the kingdom. He had done the same to the Lombard bankers, a group of Italian financiers who operated in his realm. In each case, his actions were cloaked in the language of religious piety and national interest, but his true motive was simple greed. And now, this cold, calculating gaze fell upon the Templars. The Templar Order was the single wealthiest institution in France. The Paris Temple was the center of their banking operations, and Philip himself was deeply in debt to them. The idea of canceling his debts and seizing their immense treasury for himself must have been an irresistible temptation. But the Templars were not a helpless minority like the Jews or the Lombard bankers. They were a powerful military order, revered throughout Christendom and, most importantly, protected by the Pope. To move against them would be a risky and audacious gamble. But Philip was a patient and methodical man, and he had a secret weapon, his chief minister, a ruthless and brilliant lawyer named Guillaume de Nogaret. Nogaret was the architect of Philip's most aggressive policies, a man who believed that the interests of the French state, as embodied by the king, trumped all other laws, including the laws of the church. Together, Philip and Nogaret began to lay the groundwork for a conspiracy, a carefully orchestrated campaign to destroy the Knights Templar and seize their wealth. They began by spreading rumors, dark whispers about the secret rituals and heretical practices of the order. They found a key informant, a man named Escu de Fleuren, a disgruntled, expelled Templar who was willing to provide a list of sensational, and likely false, accusations in exchange for his own freedom. The story he told was a shocking catalog of blasphemy and depravity. He claimed that during their secret initiation ceremonies, new recruits were forced to deny Jesus Christ, to spit on the crucifix, and to engage in obscene kisses. He claimed that the Templars worshipped a demonic idol, a mysterious head known as Baphomet, and he accused them of institutionalized homosexuality. These accusations were designed to be as shocking as possible, to turn public opinion against the once revered order, and to paint them not as holy warriors, but as a sinister, heretical cult. Armed with these accusations, Philip moved to secure the cooperation of the one man whose authority he needed to proceed, the Pope. The current Pope, Clement V, was a Frenchman who owed his election to Philip's influence. Philip had even persuaded him to move the papal court from Rome to Avignon, a city in southern France, where he was effectively under the king's control. Clement was a weak and indecisive man, and he found himself in an impossible position. He was the only master the Templars were sworn to obey, and he was under immense pressure from the most powerful king in Europe to sanction their destruction. Philip, growing impatient with the Pope's hesitation, decided to act on his own authority. In secret, he issued sealed orders to his royal officials in every corner of France. These orders were to be opened and acted upon at the exact same time, all across the kingdom. The plan was audacious in its scope and its precision. On the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, the trap was sprung. The day began like any other. In the hundreds of Templar preceptories across France, the brothers rose before dawn for their morning prayers. They were monks and soldiers, farmers and administrators, old men and young recruits. They had no idea that their world was about to end. As the sun rose, royal officials, accompanied by armed soldiers, descended upon every Templar house in the kingdom. They unsealed their orders and, in the name of the king, arrested every Templar they could find. The operation was a stunning success. The Templars were taken completely by surprise. They were a military order, but their preceptories in France were not fortresses. They were unfortified agricultural estates. They offered no resistance. In Paris, the aged Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was arrested along with dozens of his high-ranking knights. He had been in France to meet with the Pope, trying to plan a new crusade, completely unaware of the conspiracy against him. Within a few hours, thousands of Templars, from the highest commander to the humblest brother, were in chains, their properties seized, their vast treasury in Paris secured by the king's men. The date, Friday the 13th, would forever after be associated with bad luck, its dark reputation born from this single, dramatic event. The news of the arrest sent a shockwave across Europe. No one could believe it. The accusations were so monstrous, so at odds with the Templars' centuries-long reputation for piety and courage, that they seemed impossible. But Philip and Nogaret had played their hand brilliantly. They now had the bodies of the Templars in their dungeons, and they had a powerful weapon to make them confess to any crime the king desired: the brutal and systematic use of torture. The great trial of the Knights Templar was about to begin, and it would be one of the most unjust and horrifying episodes in the history of the medieval world. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ were now helpless prisoners, at the mercy of a greedy king and a ruthless state. Their long and bloody trial would seal their fate and create a dark legend that would endure for centuries to come. Of course, here is the fourth and final 5,000-word part of the script, detailing the trial, the dissolution, and the enduring legend of the Knights Templar. With the Knights Templar imprisoned in dungeons across France, their vast assets seized by the crown, King Philip the Fair and his minister Guillaume de Nogaret moved to the next phase of their audacious plan, to prove the order guilty of heresy and depravity, thereby justifying their destruction and the permanent confiscation of their wealth. The weapon they would use to achieve this was the medieval world's most feared and effective tool for extracting information, whether true or false: the systematic and brutal application of torture. The prisoners were handed over to royal agents and, in some cases, to Dominican inquisitors. In the dark, cold confines of their cells, the Templars, men who had faced down Saracen armies with unflinching courage, were now subjected to a different kind of horror. The methods of the Inquisition were designed to break the body in order to break the will. Knights were stretched on the rack, their limbs slowly pulled from their sockets. Their feet were coated in grease and held over open flames, burning the flesh from the bone. Heavy weights were used to crush their limbs. They were subjected to starvation, sleep deprivation, and endless psychological torment. Under this unimaginable agony, the vast majority of the knights, including the Grand Master Jacques de Molay, confessed. They confessed to everything. The list of charges, meticulously drafted by Nogaret, was a sensational and bizarre catalog of sin. The central accusation was that of heresy during their secret initiation ceremony. The prisoners confessed that they were forced to deny Jesus Christ 3 times, sometimes spitting, trampling, or urinating on a crucifix. This was the most shocking charge, designed to horrify the pious populace of Europe. While it's possible some strange ritual existed within the order as a test of obedience, perhaps simulating the denial of Christ under capture by Saracens, the Inquisitors twisted it into an act of genuine apostasy. They also confessed to worshipping an idol, a mysterious bearded head that they called Baphomet. The origin of this name is a source of intense debate. Some scholars believe it was simply a French corruption of the name Muhammad or Muhammad, and the charge was a way to accuse the Templars of secretly converting to Islam. Others suggest it is related to Gnostic or other esoteric traditions. Whatever its origin, the image of the Templars secretly worshipping a demonic, severed head was a powerful and terrifying piece of propaganda. The prisoners also confessed to the obscene kiss, being forced to kiss their superior on the navel, the base of the spine, and the mouth. And finally, they confessed to institutionalized homosexuality, a charge designed to paint their monastic, all-male brotherhood as a den of debauchery. Under torture, men will say anything to make the pain stop. The confessions, taken down by scribes, were remarkably similar, suggesting the prisoners were being fed the answers their torturers wanted to hear. Within weeks of the arrests, Philip had a mountain of signed confessions. He presented this evidence to a skeptical world as proof of the order's guilt. The speed and uniformity of the confessions were, to him, a sign of their truthfulness. To others, it was a clear sign of coercion. Pope Clement V was in an increasingly desperate position. The Templars were a religious order under his direct authority. A secular king had no right to put them on trial. Philip's actions were a direct challenge to papal power. Clement, summoning what courage he could, attempted to intervene. He issued a papal bull suspending the trials and ordering that the Templars and their property be handed over to the control of the Church. He announced that the papacy itself would conduct a proper investigation into the order. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the Templars might receive a fair hearing. Papal commissions were established, and Templar prisoners were brought before them. Crucially, when they were out of the hands of the king's torturers and under the protection of the Pope, many of the knights found their courage. Dozens, then hundreds, of Templars began to publicly recant their confessions. They stated, in detail, that they had only confessed because of the extreme torture they had endured. One knight showed the commissioners the small bones from his feet, which had fallen out after they had been repeatedly burned. They described the horrors of the rack and the thumbscrews. A coordinated defense of the order began to form. Jacques de Molay himself, before the papal commissioners, revoked his confession, baring his chest to show the marks of torture. He and the other leaders were prepared to defend the honor of the order, believing that the Pope, their true master, would protect them and ensure justice was done. King Philip watched as his carefully constructed case began to unravel. If the Templars were allowed to mount a defense, and if the Pope were to find them innocent, Philip would not only be denied their wealth, but he would also be exposed as a liar and a tyrant who had brutally tortured the holy warriors of Christ. His reputation and his authority would be in tatters. He and Nogaret knew they had to act swiftly and ruthlessly to crush the Templar defense before it could gain any more momentum. In 1310, Philip made a move of shocking brutality. He bypassed the authority of the papal commission entirely. He declared that the Templars who had recanted their confessions were relapsed heretics. Under the rules of the Inquisition, a heretic who confessed and then later withdrew their confession was considered to have relapsed into sin, a crime for which the only punishment was death. Philip ordered that dozens of these recanting Templars, the key leaders of the defense, be taken from their cells. On a cold morning in May, 54 Knights Templar were brought to a field outside of Paris. They were tied to stakes, and with the Archbishop of Sens, a puppet of the king, presiding, they were slowly burned to death. As the flames rose, they maintained their innocence and the innocence of the order to the very end, praying to God and the Virgin Mary. The effect of this mass execution was exactly what Philip had intended. It was an act of pure terror. The Templar defense collapsed overnight. When the remaining prisoners were brought before the papal commissioners, they were too terrified to speak. They knew that to deny their original, forced confessions would mean a certain and agonizing death at the stake. They fell silent or simply confirmed their original testimony. The Pope's investigation was effectively neutered. Philip had won. Pope Clement V was now completely cornered. He knew that the confessions were tainted, but he was powerless against the French king. In 1311, he convened a great church council in the city of Vienne, in southern France, to decide the final fate of the order. Even here, the majority of the bishops present were not convinced of the Templars' guilt and were reluctant to condemn an entire holy order based on such dubious evidence. But Philip was not about to be denied. He marched his army to the gates of Vienne, a clear and unambiguous threat to the Pope and the Council. Clement, weak and broken, engineered a compromise. He would not formally declare the Templar order guilty of heresy. The evidence was simply too weak. But he also would not find them innocent. Instead, in the spring of 1312, he issued a papal bull titled Vox in Excelso. In this document, he stated that although the guilt of the order as a whole had not been proven, the scandal surrounding it was now so great, the reputation of the Templars so tarnished, that for the good of the Church, the order could no longer be allowed to exist. And so, by an inviolable and perpetual decree, the Order of the Knights Templar was officially dissolved and abolished. It was not a legal conviction but an administrative act, a political execution. In a subsequent bull, Ad Providum, the Pope ordered that all of the Templars' vast properties and wealth should be transferred to their great rivals, the Knights Hospitaller. This, of course, was not what King Philip wanted to hear. But in practice, he got his way. He claimed vast sums from the Templar treasury to cover the supposed costs of the trial, and he held on to their French estates for years, milking them for revenue before finally handing over the depleted properties to the Hospitallers. The Templars who had confessed were sentenced to life in prison. Those who had maintained their innocence from the start were often acquitted, but the order they had dedicated their lives to was gone. But there was one final, dramatic act left to play in this long and tragic story. The leaders of the order, including the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, and his close companion, Geoffroy de Charny, had been languishing in a royal prison for nearly 7 years. Because they had confessed, the Pope had reserved their final sentencing for himself. In March of 1314, 3 cardinals were dispatched to Paris to deliver the final verdict. On the 18th of March, a scaffold was erected in the square before the great cathedral of Notre Dame. A huge crowd gathered to witness the end of the Templar saga. Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny, now old and broken men after years of imprisonment, were brought out before the crowd and the cardinals. The sentence was read. For their confessed heresies, they were condemned to perpetual imprisonment. It was meant to be a quiet, anticlimactic end to the affair. But then, something completely unexpected happened. As the sentence was being read, the aged Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, suddenly found his voice. He stood up, and in a loud, clear tone that rang across the square, he did the one thing that King Philip had never expected. He utterly and completely recanted his confession. He proclaimed to the assembled crowd that all the charges against the order were false, and that he had only confessed to save himself from the agony of torture. He declared that the order of the Knights Templar was pure and holy, and that he was ready to die to defend its honor. Beside him, Geoffroy de Charny did the same. The crowd was stunned. The cardinals were thrown into confusion. King Philip, who was likely present in the palace nearby, was enraged. This was a final, defiant act of rebellion that threatened to undo everything. It publicly challenged the legitimacy of the entire trial. Philip did not hesitate. He declared that Molay and de Charny were relapsed heretics, and that very same day, he ordered their immediate execution. As evening fell, a pyre was built on a small island in the middle of the River Seine. Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny were brought to the stake. As the executioners bound them, Molay is said to have requested that he be tied facing the Cathedral of Notre Dame so that he could look upon the house of God in his final moments. As the fire was lit, he showed no fear. He remained steadfast, proclaiming the order's innocence until the very end, his voice rising above the crackle of the flames. And it is here that the story enters the realm of legend. According to a tradition that arose shortly after, as he was dying in the flames, Jacques de Molay uttered a final, terrible curse. He summoned King Philip the Fair and Pope Clement V to appear with him before the judgment seat of God within a year. Whether the curse was real or not, what happened next is a matter of historical fact. Pope Clement V, already in poor health, died just 1 month later from a sudden illness. And King Philip the Fair, still only in his 40s, died before the year was out, after suffering a stroke during a hunting trip. The 2 men who had orchestrated the destruction of the Knights Templar were both dead. To the people of France, it seemed that the Grand Master's curse had been fulfilled. It was a final, posthumous victory for the martyred knights. And so, the Order of the Knights Templar, which had begun with 9 poor knights in Jerusalem, came to a fiery and tragic end on a small island in the Seine. But their story was far from over. The sudden and brutal nature of their destruction combined with their immense wealth and their reputation for secrecy, created a fertile ground for myths and legends to grow. What had happened to their vast treasure, which the King of France had never fully located? Had they secretly hidden it away before the arrests? And what of the surviving Templars, those who had been acquitted or who had escaped the initial raids? Over the centuries, a rich and complex mythology grew up around the fallen order. They became the secret guardians of the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, and the sacred bloodline of Christ. They were said to have possessed secret knowledge, esoteric wisdom brought back from the Holy Land. And they were claimed as the direct ancestors of later secret societies, most famously, the Freemasons, who adopted much of the Templar symbolism and structure in their own rituals. The line between the historical Templars and the legendary Templars began to blur, creating an enduring myth that continues to fascinate us to this day. They are the subjects of novels, of movies, and of endless speculation. The historical reality is that the surviving Templars were absorbed into other orders or simply faded back into secular life. Their wealth was largely given to the Hospitallers or seized by the kings of Europe. But the legend is, in some ways, more powerful than the reality. The story of the Knights Templar is a timeless and tragic tale of piety and violence, of immense power and a sudden, catastrophic fall. It is a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of wealth, the dangers of unchecked power, and the fragility of justice in the face of greed and political ambition. It is a story that began with a noble and selfless mission to protect the weak and ended in the smoke and flames of a judicial murder. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ were destroyed, but their story, their mystery, and their legend will endure for as long as we continue to tell it. And with that, dear listener, our long journey into the world of the warrior monks comes to a close. I hope that this story of their rise and fall has offered a quiet and fascinating escape into a time long past. May the tale of their faith, their courage, and their tragic end serve as a reminder of the great and often terrible dramas that have shaped our world. Thank you for joining me in this quiet corner of history. If you enjoyed our time together, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe and share these tales. There are so many more stories waiting to be told. But for now, I will bid you a fond good night. Sleep well, stay safe, and I'll see you next time for another journey into the past. Sweet dreams.